Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on biomedical instrumentation. We started looking at ECG. In this video, we will look at an overview of the cardiac cycle to give you an idea of how the heart functions, so that when we discuss ECG in future, it becomes more clearer. This is done using a specific diagram called as a Vigor's diagram. Vigor's diagram, through which we will review the cardiac cycle. Usually in the ECG there is a P wave, that is here. The ECG here is shown in green. So, there is a P wave, and that is followed by atrial systole. Atria will contract. This is the time when the auricles or the atria will contract. This will lead to a situation in which the atrial pressure increases. So, this is the point at which P wave happens. After that, you see there is an increase in atrial pressure. So, the line in orange is the atrial pressure. You see that after that point there is, please follow the red line here, we will go to the next picture, maybe it is slightly bigger. So, after the P wave, that is the point at which the P wave happens. After that, you see that the atrial pressure increases, also the ventricular pressure increases. Okay, both ventricular pressure is in blue, atrial pressure is in orange. So, after the P wave, atria contract, leading to a situation in which atrial pressure increases and ventricular pressure also increases, slightly increases. Okay. And the blend starts filling the ventricles. There is a small increase in volume that you see. So, when you go back here, after the P wave, there is a small increase in the volume of the ventricles. Then what happens is the QRS complex. That is the QRS complex. In this case, here is the QRS complex. This is the time when the ventricles contract. So, the time between the time when the P wave, after the P wave and the time before the QRS complex is the atrial systole. That is the time when the atria contract. After the QRS complex is when the ventricles contract, that is the ventricular systole, right. That is the time when the volume does not change, because both the valves are closed. Both the valves are closed. Actually, the status of the valves are mentioned here. The status of the valves are mentioned here. At around the QRS complex here is when the mitral valve closes. It not, the mitral valve closes at the QRS complex. So, the valves are closed, and then there is contraction of the ventricle that happens, right. This is the time when both the valves, the aortic valve is closed, the mitral valve is closed, but the contraction of the ventricle happens. What will happen? This is isovolumetric contraction. Iso means equal, volumetric, it says isovolumic. Isovolumetric essentially means at equal volume, at the same volume contraction happens. If contraction happens at the same volume, then the pressure will suddenly start building up in a very big way. So, that is the stand line here that you see here. That is the line that you see here. That is the line that you see, that is flat. Flat means what? Volume does not change, that is the isovolumetric contraction, right. Then once the ventricle contraction continues to happen, actually the AV valves close and then the pressure rises, but the volume itself does not change, is it not? then the pressure continues to increase, and at some point what happens is, if you see the pressure, this is the aortic pressure, this is the one in red is the aortic pressure. At some point the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the aorta. At that point the aortic valve will open. At this point aortic valve opens. See, that is the point at which aortic valve will open. Like at that point aortic valve opens. What will happen when aortic valve opens? That blood that was stored in the left ventricle gets quickly ejected out into the aorta, leading to a sudden drop in the volume like that. That is that reduction in the ventricular volume due to the opening of the aortic valve. Right. Aortic valve opens and then blood is ejected relatively quickly, leading to a sudden relatively steep drop in the volume of the ventricles. Right. Now, so this, because of that ventricular pressure, after that the ventricular pressure peaks. So, around this time you see that the ventricular pressure peaks and then the pressure starts dropping. And after the pressure starts dropping, once the pressure in the ventricle goes below the pressure in the aorta, what will happen? The aortic valve will close. So, that is when, around that time is when the aortic valve will close. There will be no more. So, that is here it is shown as aortic valve closes. There will be no more flow of blood through the aorta. At that point volume remains a constant because aortic valve is already closed, the mitral valve is already closed, and then what happens is the pressure continues to drop in a very big way like this. That is the drop in the ventricular pressure. This is of course called as the isovolumetric relaxation. At the same volume, same relatively low volume, there is relaxation. This is the diastole that happens, right. So, this is the ventricular diastole that happens. Now, that is the T wave. The QRS wave essentially precedes the ventricular depolarization and the ventricular contraction, and then during isovolumetric relaxation you have the T wave, during which aortic valve is already closed and the ventricle starts relaxing at equal volume, same volume. Pressure will drop substantially. See, there is a substantial drop in the pressure, right. Substantial drop in the pressure, so much so sometimes that the atrial pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure. In that case the mitral valve will open, is it not? When, for example, when the ventricular pressure goes below the atrial pressure, at that point the mitral valve will open. At that point, that is the atrioventricular valve, mitral valve in, for example, we said the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves will open once the ventricular pressure drops below the level of the atrial pressure. Then the AV valves will open and then blood will start rushing in to the ventricles. This initial stage will lead to a sudden increase in the volume of blood. This is called as the rapid inflow of blood. This is followed by a state called diastasis, and then atrial systole completes filling. So, we were talking about, so the AV valves, when will they open? The AV valves will open when the ventricular pressure drops below the level of the atrial pressure. In orange you see the atrial pressure, in blue you see the ventricular pressure. Here is when the AV valve will open, here is when the AV valve will open. This essentially shows two cycles of the two cardiac cycles, right. And then at that time there is a rapid inflow, during which, during that once the mitral valve or the AV valve opens, there is a sudden increase in the volume of the blood, relatively rapid inflow. As soon as the AV valve opens, there is a rapid inflow of blood, followed by a phase during which there is minimal change in the ventricular pressure and minimal change in the atrial pressure and relatively minimal change in the ventricular volume, during which the ventricles are completely relaxing, opening up to their entire capacity, completely relaxing. This phase within the ventricular diastole is called as diastasis, the phase during which there is a plateau that is seen in both the atrial pressure, the ventricular pressure and the ventricular volume. In all these cases, there is, when you see that, that is the phase that is called as diastasis, and then there is atrial, there is the P wave that happens, the P wave that happens, P wave causes a contraction of the atrium. When the atrium contracts and then it completely, it increases, further increases the pressure, the atrial pressure, thus finishing up whatever little more blood that needs to be filled, leading to a further increase in the volume. After some time, then the ventricular pressure will start increasing due to the QRS complex. That, so there is a slightly more increase in the volume due to the atrial systole. This then is of course followed by the QRS complex, and then the cycle repeats. Now, phonocardiogram, PCG. We will look at this in detail in future weeks, I think. GSR, phonocardiogram, pulse oximetry are topics that are meant for I think week 10 or 9 or something like that. I am not able to recall which week, for one of the weeks. So, then we look at phonocardiogram. We will look at this in greater detail in future weeks. So, when the mitral valve closes, that essentially causes the first heart sound, and then when the mitral valve opens, next, in the next cycle, when the mitral valve opens, there is a flow of blood that causes a turbulence, and that is heard as the second heart sound, followed by just before diastasis, there is a third heart sound that is heard. Right. Now, merely through these sounds and the changes in the sounds, one can detect abnormalities in heart function. When there are these abnormalities, there are the so called murmurs that are heard. These murmurs may indicate either stenosis, stenosis means blocking of the valves, or regurgitation. Regurgitation means blood is flowing back, the inability of the valve to essentially perform its function. When you say a valve, it essentially is a one directional flow control mechanism, is it not? When it closes, it essentially sends some of the blood back, that is called as regurgitation. Stenosis is a situation in which complete amount of blood cannot flow through because there is something that is obstructing the way, that is called as stenosis. There is the details are beyond the scope of this course, but are at least for future videos. Some of these can be heard as abnormal heart sounds or abnormal murmurs, which we will discuss in future videos. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at the Vigor's diagram and a good description of the cardiac cycle.